budding archaeologists. Today we'll talk about seriation, which, as you can read, refers to the chronological ordering of archaeological data by style or by frequency. Very typically, this archaeological data will be artifacts. And the core assumption that underlies all seriation efforts is that things that look alike tend to belong to the same period of time than things that look different. We'll talk about two types of seriation here. The first, stylistic. The second is frequency. You have an exercise related to both in our module. So let's begin. Seriation, I think, is something you already know quite a bit about. And so if we look at some pictures I lifted from the internet of Chryslers, we'll look at some historic pictures of these. And they come in no particular order. It's sort of a random assortment of cars. And so look at the very first picture here. And as you look at this, try to imagine what period of time this car belongs to, when it was initially manufactured, I mean. This picture is probably the easiest of the ones to follow because you have all sorts of additional information here, right? You have the two women and how they're dressed. You have sort of the background, and the rest will not be quite as complicated. So we have car number one here. Now let's move to the second. Yet another Chrysler. And imagine to yourself, well, when was this car probably manufactured? Now, you may not have this down to the year or anything, but perhaps you have this down to the decade. So we have these two cars, the one we just had here, car number one and car number two. Which one do you imagine is earlier and which one do you imagine is later, by contrast? And why? Now, it's easy and simple when you just have two things, but let's move on to a few more. So here's car number three. And while you and I would probably agree for various reasons that this car is probably older than, say, this car, we have to wonder if it's older than this or not. And why might that be? So, car number three. Number four. Great look, I think, for a car. There's number four, and then finally, number five. Look at that puppy. Okay, so if we look at all these together on one slide, we have five cars, and what I'd like you to do at this point is try to order these in correct chronological order from earliest to latest. So again, read this like a comic book. So at the upper left here is car number one, then car number two to your upper right. In the middle, to the left, car number three, and to the right, car number four, and at the very bottom, car number five. So pause the video at this point and try to come up with the correct chronological sequence, and we'll see how well you did in a moment. Alright, well, I hope you tried, and so here are the answers. Car number one, the one in France with two women in front of it, was indeed the oldest. Actually, no, the second oldest in the sequence. Car number three was the oldest, 1934, look at that. Car number one was the second oldest. And then car number one and car number five are right about the same period in time. Car number one, of course, is a little bit older, but not by too much. Car number four is in the 60s, and car number two, as you might have imagined, is the very youngest. And so let's look at this again. It goes 3, 1, 5, 4, 2. So 3 being the oldest, then 1, then 5. And 1 and 5 ought to look alike, right? Because they're about roughly the same period of time, late 40s, early 50s. And then we have our 1960 Mobile, 1963. And then a more recent and modern version of the Chrysler. Now, if you look at these for a moment, knowing that our core assumption is that things that look alike tend to be from the same general period of time, and then look at sort of the boxy character of car number one and car number five. They tend to look the most alike out of any pairing of cars you can imagine making out of these five. And so the core assumption behind a stylistic seriation effort, which is what we're doing, ordering things based on how they look, seems to be validated in this case. And the most odd looking cars, stylistically speaking, are car number 3 and car number 2, and it's perhaps unsurprising then that they belong to either end of the continuum, the earliest and the very latest at the same time. And so if you know anything about cars, not that you have to be a gearhead, but you probably know this already, and you can do this with fashion, particularly women's fashion changes rapidly, whereas men's fashion changes, but at a very glacial or slow pace. You can do this with music, you can do this with nearly anything. Let's move on to an archaeological example. Here we have 8 handles from coffins. These coffins were found in a graveyard, and as sometimes happens with archaeologists, it's necessary to relocate historic graveyards from time to time because, say, a reservoir is being built and the area has been dammed up and the water's rising and the whole graveyard will be flooded. And so it's necessary to sort of dig up various graves and relocate them to a high and a dry place. And we might imagine that this cemetery is very, very old, and that many of the inscriptions on the gravestones at the surface, if they've survived at all, are highly eroded and basically illegible. So of these 8 coffin handles, which come from 8 different individual graves, we can imagine that we have the gravestone, which is legible for coffin handle number 4 and coffin handle number 16. So we'll say that coffin handle number 4 dates to 1822. The date of death, at least on the gravestone, is 1822. And the date of death for coffin handle 16, let's say, is 1868. So those two obviously belong to the 19th century, but they're 4 decades apart. That's all the information we'll have here. And we need to try to order things correctly based on style, just like we did with the cars previously. Knowing that things that look like coffin handle 4 are probably closer to 1822 than things that look like coffin handle 16, which are probably closer to 1868. So, we have 8 things, and this is somewhat analogous to the exercise you'll be doing for me. What do? We have a mess. These things are also in no particular order, like our cars. The numbers really don't mean anything at all. They're just convenient labels for us. Well, the first thing to do is to create 2 or more groups, especially sort of mega groups. So we might imagine creating 2 groups out of this mess, or perhaps even 3. And members in individual groups need to obviously look more alike than with members in a neighboring group. And so look at this slide then and determine for yourself how you'd order this. There's many different ways. My eye, for example, is immediately drawn to a bit of the coffin hardware, sort of the outer edges of each individual coffin handle. Other students, sometimes their eye is drawn to the interior, to the handle itself. Some of them have this raised bump in the middle. Others have a little motif, which we'll talk about in a moment, in the middle. Others have all sorts of jazz going on. So order them by however you see fit. There's no right way to start this sort of thing, besides making these groups. So let's move on to how I made them based on the exterior of the handles themselves. I created one group I call the oak group because the exterior of the coffin handles look to me like oak leaves, and indeed they have acorns and stuff, which would indicate they belong to the oak family. And I made another group I call the Bible group. Now I don't know whether these are truly Bibles, but if we expand this for a second, goodness, then you can see there's sort of a book here which is open, which is found on either end. And since that same sort of book is associated with a cross over here, then I'm imagining that book is likely a Bible. Alright, so we have a group that has these so-called oak leaves and acorns. We have one which has the Bible. We could have easily put handle number 20 in this group because it appears to have the same Bible itself, but I singled it out as the oddest looking of the bunch. And just like our cars, the oddest looking of the bunch typically belongs to, not always, but generally belongs to the very earliest in the sequence or the very latest. So I made 3 groups out of this. And what we can turn to next then is looking at each individual group and making sort of subgroups in that. So again, if you've forgotten already, we know that coffin handle number 4 down here dates to 1822. And we know that coffin handle 16 over here dates to 1868. So what this should immediately tell us is that the oak group is probably earlier. Maybe not every single coffin handle is earlier, but at least there's a tendency for that group to be a little bit earlier in age than the Bible group. So let's break down the oak group into sort of smaller subgroups and move from there. So here's our oak group that we just made. And I've made 2 groups out of this one group. And these 2 groups, to me, deal with having these sort of 5 points to the oak leaf, whereas handle 15 tends to have 3. In fact, if you squint sideways at handle 15, the 3 points to the oak leaves almost look like a cross. And so let's just consider that the oddball for the time being, at least according to my criteria. Handle 4 and 6 are similar in the sense that they have this just one acorn hanging off the end there. However, handle 3 and 4 are similar in the sense that they have this sort of same motif in the middle. And if we expand this a little bit and look at that motif, you'll see there are 2 hands holding each other, presumably shaking hands, and we call this the clasp hand motif. And if we look to our Bible group, we'll notice that that same motif is present in 2 out of the 3 handles. Oh my goodness. Things are going haywire. There it is. See the clasp hand motif. Sure, the hands look a little bit different, but the same general motif is identifiable. Okay. So, again, we know that handle 4 dates to round about 1822. That does not mean, however, that handle 4 is the absolute earliest in the sequence, in the entire sequence. So, knowing that the Bible group tends to come a bit later on average, or at least we suspect that for the time being, and that handles 4 and 3 have the clasp hand motif in common with 2 members of the Bible group, we might suspect that handles 3 and 4 date to a later period in time. So now we're left with, well, what do we do with handle 6? So it's the most different of the 2, and it has no real parallel in any of the Bible group handles. If it dated to a later period in time, we might expect something to be similar. So what we can do is move handle 6 for the time being to the very earliest position, at least in the oak group sequence. Handle 15, we don't really know what to do with it. It's an oddball. If you're buying my story about the oak leaves looking like crosses, then perhaps it belongs at the very end of a sequence. In other words, it's the earliest. So we might provisionally order this as handle 6 being the oldest, handle 4 and handle 3, although you might reverse that, it depends. And then handle 15 being the youngest. It does have multiple acorns. Handle 3 has multiple acorns. It seems to make at least some sense for the time being there. So, moving on to our Bible group, as we did before, we have the clasp hand motif. We know that those need to be more or less similar in time to the clasp hand motifs of the oak group. Now, if we look at sort of the depiction of the Bible, here on the edges, the 19 and 16 are very similar. You have the good book, right? You have these circular edges where we have sort of a square or rectangular edge here. So in a sense, 11 is the most different from these guys, and we might wonder whether where that belongs. Because it shares the clasp hand motif where with the oak group that we just looked at, it probably belongs sort of on the older end, whereas 16, which has a handle we've never seen before, something brand new, probably belongs on the younger end since it represents a bit of an oddball here. Then we have our cross. We have the Bibles there, and usually with the oddest of them all, it's usually the youngest or the oldest. Well, notice the handle with the bump in it, which has some parallel with the handle with the bump in it with 16, which we already provisionally identified as the youngest of the Bible group. And so we might therefore put our cross as the very youngest in this group, at least those with the Bibles. And so if we look at the sort of real-world solution to this, we realize that your seriation efforts might not, like in our cars, produce one unbroken chronological sequence. And they might have two parallel sequences at the same time. So the column to our left is the oak group. The column to your right here is sort of the Bible group, and handle 20 being the one with the crosses and the Bible. And if you remember, and you can click back through the video, handles 3, 4, 11, and 19 all had the clasp hand motif. Therefore, they sort of belong in the same general period of time. That motif disappears in handles 15, 16, and 20, which we've identified as the youngest. And so if we go back to sort of the dates we know about, handle 4 and handle 16, handle 4 being 1822, handle 16 being 1868, that checks out in our little sequence here. And so if we look at the style of handle 6, for example, and we find similar styles in other graveyards, we can argue with a reasonable probability that handles of that style probably predate, although we don't know by how much they predate, but they probably predate 1822, at least if we're talking about the same region of the world. And that handles with those three-pointed oak leaves or with full-blown crosses themselves are probably equal to or later than 1868, the date for handle 16. Now, why might we have two sequences sort of overlapping and moving in parallel, the oak group and the so-called Bible group? Well, there may be any number of reasons for that. Just like not everyone on Earth drives a Chrysler, for example. Sometimes people choose different things. Sometimes these are personal choices. Sometimes they're ethnic choices. Sometimes they're class choices. Sometimes they're gender choices. And so we archaeologists always have to be on the lookout for that. Now, the good news for you is that when you do your stylistic seriation using moche pottery, you can expect to arrive at one single unbroken sequence. So we're introducing something more complicated here. Your exercise is a little bit simpler in reality. Let's move on to frequency seriation. This is usually using the proportions or the percentages of an artifact type. And if we consider an artifact type as something that starts out as a fad that very few people consume or use, then rises in popularity, and many people, in fact even the majority of people, may use or consume this product, and then they fall out of fashion, right? And then we arrive at, well, another situation where very few people still choose to use or consume this product. We arrive at something we all archaeologists know and love as the battleship-shaped curve. So in the center here is a picture of a battleship. You see it's skinny at either end and fat in the middle, kind of like some archaeology professors, I suppose. And this is sort of a statistical thing. If we imagine the fatness of our diamond or battleship here, then the fatter it is, the larger the proportion or the percentage. The skinnier it is, the smaller the proportion or the percentage. And so this is sort of an expectation, or an assumption about how archaeological data tend to order themselves through time. So let's look at a real-world example many of you may be familiar with, and that is social media. We can, and these are very rough and not terribly to scale. If they were to scale, Facebook would dwarf everything else and actually obscure the patterns, because Facebook is, of course, the #1 site in the world, at least as I speak here in 2012. And so some of you may be too young to remember, but if you remember the phenomenon of MySpace, MySpace got its start around about 2003 as something MySpace employees called Friendster once upon a time. So the first users of the social media platform were painfully few. It was just people that were employees of the company. What they did toward the end of 2003 and 2004 is invite through email 20 million people, especially young people, who started signing up for individual profiles in droves. So it started out with something that was used by relatively few people and was worth essentially nothing. Many of those 20 million people signed up and in turn invited their friends and family. And by 2005, MySpace was worth roughly $580 million. By 2006, 100 million people had signed up for the platform, and it was worth more or less $1.52 billion. The end of 2007 and perhaps early 2008 was sort of the heyday for MySpace. It was worth, they estimate, it wasn't sold at this time, but it was worth, say, $12 billion. Just an enormous, gigantic amount for this era. By the end of 2008, 2009, a little fledgling social media platform, Facebook, was starting to become a behemoth. And it was right around 2008, especially toward the end of it, that Facebook surpassed MySpace in users and popularity. Facebook has suffered a decline, a precipitous decline, since then to the present day. These are the fortunes, I suppose, of internet companies. By the end of 2009, after being worth $12 billion in 2007, it was estimated to be worth, say, $1 billion. By 2010, 2011, 30% of the workers at MySpace were laid off, and Justin Timberlake bought the thing for $35 million, they say, at the end of 2011, early 2012. So hopefully Justin Timberlake is not watching, but from an archaeological point of view, MySpace has enjoyed the battleship shape curve and is now on the losing end of that. Now, if we tell the story of Facebook, right, then it's sort of an opposite tale. If you've seen the movie The Social Network, then you know this all too well. 2003, 2004, basically no one. We have our first sort of public invites opening up to high schoolers in a way in 2005. By 2007, when MySpace is rolling, Facebook, what I think might have been still called the Facebook at that time, was worth $240 million. It wasn't really until 2009, 2010 that it was really turning a profit for its employees. And now, in 2012, the present day, its value is estimated at over $100 billion. So whereas MySpace topped out at $12 billion, Facebook is over $100 billion now and climbing. And so when you do a frequency seriation, you always want to have artifacts or phenomena of the same style. It makes sense to compare cars to cars, for example. It makes sense to compare coffin handles to coffin handles. It makes sense to compare social media websites to social media websites. It doesn't make a lot of sense, in other words, to compare MySpace to coffin handles in a way. So always try to compare like to like and ensure that you're doing so from the very beginning. Now here's sort of an archaeological example. This comes from the archaeologist whose name is James Dietz, and wrote a very famous and small book that inspired a lot of people called "In Small Things Forgotten." So I encourage you to check this out if you're interested in archaeology and want to read sort of a classic here. And what he did is looked at early New England gravestones, 18th century for the most part, and early 19th century, and you can see the battleship shaped curve appear at least in the middle there. and we have just portions of that battleship shape curve to the left and to the right. So when you attempt a frequency seriation, it's important not to assume the entire battleship shape curve ought to be present. Sometimes it will be for one artifact type or one style type, but will not be for the others. And so this is calculated simply by taking proportions or percentages of these gravestone styles, these tombstone styles, in cemeteries and ordering it by decade. Archaeological data is sometimes a little messier than that. That's sort of the ideal scenario, what James Dietz arrived at. Sometimes the battleship shape curve doesn't look much like a battleship at all. Sometimes it goes from fat to skinny to fat. Sometimes it goes from fat to horribly skinny, kind of like in the middle here. It might be sort of the MySpace type of phenomena. Sometimes you have very little data to work with, like we have in this column to our right, or sometimes no data in some cases, as the second column in. What you always want to do with frequency seriations is work with the data you actually have, right? And so you're going to privilege the ones where you have sort of fatter bars, in a sense, and not worry too much about the very skinny ones, because it's an old axiom in archaeology is that small samples don't mean very much. So you want to hang your hat on then the larger samples in the data set. And so if we're going to order this thing, then artifact style 1, 3, and 4 are the ones to worry about. Don't even think about 2 and 5 until perhaps the very end of the seriation effort. So let's turn to a practice example to conclude our little online lecture. And we'll assume we have 6 sites, Site A, Site B, Site C, through F. And we have 4 styles of artifacts. And we might imagine that style 4 is, I don't know, to use sort of a analogy with musical technology, style 4 are records. Now a collector's item, because no one really uses records anymore. Well, at least not too many people, right? We might consider style 1, 2, and 3 to be sort of CDs, cassettes, 8 tracks, although we might not know which is which. But style 4 is definitely records. Now we want to order this thing so that each and every one of the sites corresponds to this sort of expectation of a battleship shape curve. Well, you can already see that style 1 and style 2 mimic the battleship shape curve quite well, but the whole thing falls apart once we get to style 3 and style 4. And so if you open up this PowerPoint and you're looking at, say, the video lecture here at the same time, you can notice you can click individual rows and move them around however you see fit. So if I could start moving things around, I can start this mixing and this matching exercise. And just like with the cars and just like with the coffee nails, don't assume that A means anything and C means anything at all. And we can start trying, through trial and error basically, to make things correspond to our expectation of the battleship shaped curve. So at this point I'll let you pause the video again and open up this PowerPoint and try to mess around and see if you can't arrive at the best fit. So it's a bit of a puzzle, I suppose. So let's turn to what the answers are. And here they are. And so knowing that style 4 are the records, we would expect them to enjoy their popularity earliest in time. And Site F, as you see, had the greatest proportion of records. It also has the greatest proportion of style 3, which we'll call sort of our 8-track cassettes. Some of you might have to ask your parents about what those were. Style 2, if we consider it just cassettes, tape cassettes, and style 1, CDs. Now you wouldn't find any of these things in the dump so much anymore unless people are liquidating their garages, because not a lot of people listen to their music on MP3s for the most part. And so what we can say then through our frequency seriation is that Site F is the oldest and Site B is likely the youngest. And we have good portions at least of battleship shape curves in style 1, 2, and 3. Style 4 throws a little oddball with us. We have sort of a resurgence after disappearance of our artifact type, as might be expected if people hang on to stuff in their garages or in their attics for a long time. Then suddenly throw it all out during spring cleaning after 10 years, after realizing it's really not going to be worth a lot of money like perhaps they thought. And so this is our best fit then for our data set. And we can start to talk about Site A as being older than Site C, than Site B. We cannot say, however, how much older or how much younger, which is why this is all an example of relative dating. You can arrive at statements like older than, younger than, or same age as, perhaps, but you can't easily quantify that in terms of calendar years. That sort of thing is reserved for absolute dating in archaeology. These techniques that we're looking at here, especially the stylistic seriation techniques, were pioneered by the archaeologist Sir Flinders Petrie in Egypt in 1899, when he was walking over sites in the Egyptian desert, looking at different styles of broken pottery, and wondering if he could start ordering sites on the basis of those styles of broken pottery into a chronological sequence. So the spirit of all of this dates back well over 100 years in the Nile Valley. So I'll let you turn now to your attempts at a stylistic seriation and a frequency seriation. When you're ready, when you think you have your attempt good and you're ready to sort of verify whether you're correct, there's sort of a quiz online you can sort of enter your answers into, and the quiz will grade you and tell you how correct or how incorrect you'll be. So if there are any questions, please do not hesitate to email me or to call my office phone. Good luck, everybody.